the first time you see her. Certainly not the first time for us in Modena to have this honor opportunity to welcome Naomi Barron, Emerita Professor at American University, Washington, Professor Emerita of Linguistics, a former Guggenheim Fellow, Fulbright Fellow, visiting scholar at the Stanford Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. She has published quite a number of books. I will only mention those that appeared after we actually met and we've sort of remained in contact all through. I've watched her write all these wonderful books where I was wasting my time. Books like Always On, Language in an Online and Mobile World, which won the English-Speaking Union's Duke of Edinburgh English Language Book Award for 2008. Words on Screen, The Fate of Reading in a Digital World, 2015. And her newest book, How We Read Now, Strategic Choices for Print, Screen and Audio, was published in 2021, March 2021. Naomi has taught at different universities, Brown University, Emory University, Southwestern University, before getting to American University. She was executive director of the University Center for Teaching, Research and Learning for 6 years. And she has been visiting professor at many different universities or lecturing at many different universities in Sweden, in Norway, in Switzerland, and in Modena. As you can see from the background, we have adopted her and she has adopted us. Yes. It was a very special experience to have her with us. Her research includes language and technology, reading, the relationship between speech and writing, the history and the structure of English, higher education, and most recently, artificial intelligence. And this is going to be the topic today. The title of a session is Who Wrote This? Poetry, Predictive Texting, GPT-3, and You. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so very much. Before we start, I would like to play you just a little music, if I might. Come on, music. Ha-ha.
Yes, she also plays the violin.
Can you hear the music? The loudest I can make it, I think. Now, sorry for turning, but I'm using two computers to play the music and to talk. So if you saw the introductory video that I did, you will have heard that music before. And the question that I left you, and if you haven't seen the introductory video, go watch it, please. It was fun to make. And my son helped me, which is better still. But you will have heard that music before. So what's up with this music? Let's see. Okay. Come on, let's do podium. And here we go. Okay. Who wrote this? As Professor Bondi said, there's this weird title, Poetry, Predictive Texting, GPT-3, and You. What is this all about? Well, it's about, I can't change. Here we are. The music that I played on an introductory video and that I played just now, I know it sounds a little tinny because it's a recording of a recording, is actually a combination of the beginning of Beethoven's Für Elise, but in the style of Chopin, a Chopin sonata. Huh? Why combine those two? This music was indeed written by a computer. It was written by software called GPT-2, the predecessor of GPT-3, which we'll be talking about in context of GPT-3. An overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, I'd like to set the stage on some basic background on artificial intelligence. I know some of you know a lot about AI, some may know a little less. So I'll get us to the same playing field. I won't be going through a lot of detail. I won't be naming lots of names because that's not what our purpose is. It's to get a general understanding of what kinds of things artificial intelligence historically could do, what it can do now, and then that will lead us to talking specifically about what's called natural language processing, both the use of computers to understand language that's generated either by writing or by speech, as well as to talk about natural language generation, that is computers producing either spoken or written language on its own. We'll talk about the role of artificial intelligence as an author, looking at that historically as well as to the present. The role of AI as a helpmate, for those of you who took the survey, and I stopped looking last Friday, so I only got 20 of your responses. I know there were a couple more, but the deadline was June 1st, what can I say? And we'll talk about some of your responses, and then get to the question of whether humans writing really still matters given all the skills of new artificial intelligence abilities. The background on AI, let's start with a love letter, and I'll read it to you because it's so endearing. Honey dear, my sympathetic affection beautifully attracts your affectional enthusiasm. You are my loving adoration, my breathless adoration. My fellow feeling breathlessly hopes for your dear eagerness. My lovesick adoration cherishes your vivid ardor. Yours wistfully, signed M.U.C. M.U.C. Muck. M.U.C. is Manchester University Computer. And we'll get to the background on that when we talk about AI as authors. Let's look for a minute at the early steps in artificial intelligence. In some ways, the conversation seriously started with the work of Alan Turing, whose work I'm sure you've heard about. He created what was called the imitation game. There was a movie by that name. If you haven't seen it, please do. Today, we talk about the Turing test. And the Turing test basically asks, is it possible to create a computer, which means the software behind it, such that in conversation with a human, the human can't tell whether the interlocutor, the person on the other, the being, the entity on the other end is a person or is a computer. And that was a paper that Turing wrote in 1950. Interest in the United States in artificial intelligence, or what would come to be called artificial intelligence, because the name was not yet coined, really began in the early 1950s. In 1955, there was a group of basically computer scientists come mathematicians, one of whom was John McCarthy, who was responsible for the name artificial intelligence. And he wrote a grant to the Rockefeller Foundation, which gives money for stuff like conferences, and said, I'd like to hold, and some of my colleagues would like to hold a conference at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, during the next summer, so we can really explore together what machines can do. And in the proposal they wrote, McCarthy wrote, what the AI problem was: making a machine behave in ways that could be called intelligent if a human being were so behaving, which is really an expansion of what Alan Turing had in mind with the imitation game. Interestingly, in that proposal, one of the very first behaviors, that is making a machine behave, one of the first behaviors they wanted to explore was, and I quote from the proposal, how to make machines use language. So from the very beginning, work on artificial intelligence, although it does many kinds of things, has been focused on language. Okay, I sketched out some of the domains of artificial intelligence. This is not someone who's an expert in AI saying this is the way AI specialists talk about it. It's the way that a layperson who's interested in AI has tried to make sense of the different sorts of things that are within the domains of AI. There probably are more, but these are at least the major ones. So over on the left-hand side of the screen, natural language processing. We'll talk in more detail about that. Vision issues. So think about graphics, generations of graphics. decoding of graphics, seeing a picture of a cat and being able to figure out it's a cat with a computer program, one of the major accomplishments of some of the more powerful kinds of computer programming. Embodiment, things such as robots. Robots, we can think about robots that are industrial robots. We can think about social robots, things that move. The next domain I've just labeled information because there's been an awful lot of work starting back good 35 years ago in trying to build so-called knowledge ontologies of figuring out what do we know about the world and then create databases out of that. These became the bases for search engines. If you know about Watson, which beat the star players on the show Jeopardy, it was made by IBM, named after Thomas J. Watson, who was the founder of IBM. And then very popular, particularly in the 1980s and 90s, were things called expert systems, which would take those knowledge bases, but in a specific knowledge domain, such as how do you make soup, or how do you do a particular mechanical operation. And these have been used very widely in manufacturing as well as in medicine. And Watson now is used heavily in medicine. So you see the combination of those two. Another area which has proved very seminal is in games, particularly chess, where computers beat grandmasters in 1977. An even harder game than chess is the Chinese game of Go. And in 2016, a computer beat a Go master. Okay, how does AI work? How do we do the programming for it? Well, there have been a series of approaches that started, again, on the left-hand side of the screen, with rule-based approaches. So I'm a linguist by training, and I remember vividly the attempts to take the grammar of a language, start with English because that's where a lot of the work was originally done, and figure out, you know, what are the different lexemes, what are the different words, as it were, or word components, what are the rules of grammar, and then you combine that with knowledge bases, and that would be a great way, so we thought, to do things like translation and natural language processing. Turned out they weren't working. They weren't working for a number of reasons. Number one, we really don't know how to write full grammars of any natural language. And number two, the power of the computers at that time was just too small to work successfully. The next move was a statistical approach. Again, it was using databases. By now, it was larger databases because there was more powerful computing power, as well as corpora, say, of words and so forth. And the current model, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, is neural networks. So from there, let's segue to the right-hand side of the screen with machine learning, which is really where artificial intelligence is. By machine learning, we're talking about not having to program in how to do an operation, but rather having the machine, the computer, learn on its own. So it learns, it makes mistakes, corrects mistakes to say, no, that didn't work, let's try something else. The model now that we talk about is so-called deep learning with neural networks. And it is this model that has driven the phenomenal successes and the frightening successes, and we'll look at that as well in a minute, of what's happening with artificial intelligence these days. So what has moved the goalpost from those rule-based systems that didn't work so well to phenomenal success? You talk with Siri, for example, on an Apple device, and she, or you can put the he version in, really understands what you're saying. It's creepy. How did we get there? You go into Google Translate, and it's phenomenally impressive what it can do. It couldn't do that 5 years ago or 10 years ago. What happened? Well, there are a number of new programming concepts, particularly neural networks. Again, we'll talk about what those are. And an incredible increase in computing power that has made possible things we never thought we could do. So to just give simple examples, some of the early computer programs started with playing the game of checkers, which is much simpler than the game of chess, which is much simpler than the game of Go. You look at the early attempts at so-called machine translation or automatic translation. And there were attempts, particularly in the United States during the Cold War, to translate between Russian and English. And let's just say they didn't go far. And it was decided that this was a waste of the US government's money in investing in these programs. So machine translation almost died. And then a few places, such as for weather systems in Canada, which is bilingual, so you have to go between French and English. But doing weather forecasts is pretty simple language. And then there were various other people who said, I'm not giving up on machine translation. So the German company Siemens, which produces all kinds of equipment in various countries in the world, did programming for machine translation of its operation manuals. But today, the kind of translation we can do is phenomenal. Similarly, going back to the work of an MIT scientist, computer scientist, Jerome Wiesenbaum, back in 1966. This is ancient history. I know many of you weren't born. He created what was an ELIZA program, taking the name of Eliza Doolittle from Pygmalion, from Shaw's Pygmalion. And it was a very primitive program compared with what we can do today with, say, Siri, or this program GPT-3, which I hope you've seen the video on and read the article on. Okay, so what are the components of natural language processing? Well, machine translation is really where we got started in a serious way. And that now has become incredibly successful in a way that we never thought it could be. Natural language understanding, that is being able to take input from a human. First, it was written input, now it's spoken input as well, and make sense of it using some kind of either a rule-based system or statistical system, or these now neural network systems. Similarly, there's natural language generation, where the computer generates either based on rules or based on the neural network programming, which are not rule-based, to be able to generate language, whether it's written language or spoken language. Then I put off to the side on the right-hand side because it's been an important part of what natural language processing has been about, but it uses these other tools, looking at speech synthesis, that is taking something that's written and being able to read it aloud automatically, and then speech recognition. So you speak something such as you do with Siri, or you do on telephone trees, on a phone call to a company, and your voice is recognized and made sense of. I won't necessarily say parsed, because that was the old-fashioned technology. And then you get sent, we hope, to the right person, or you get a response from the computer. All right, let's look at natural language understanding first. The original work was done with spoken language. I remember vividly when directory assistants on the telephone, this is one with home phones, landlines, first replaced a human being with a voice recognition system. And they were pretty primitive, because if you had a strong accent, and I'm not even talking about a non-native speaker of English, I'm talking about if you were from the deep South in the United States and you said things like, I'd really like to understand what's going on here. The programs couldn't understand that. They basically understood Midwestern English, which has been a standard of spoken English for a while, rightly or wrongly. But then there are much more sophisticated programs, and generally the natural language understanding programs are coupled with natural language generation, such as that when you speak to your smart speaker, or you speak on your phone to Siri or some equivalent thereof, or Alexa on an Amazon smart speaker, language is generated back again. Okay, for written work, originally the natural language understanding was done with relational databases. There was a move by a number of corporations to say, you know, we can cut out a lot of the work that's done by administrators who were having to input all this data and search all this data. We would, you know, a lot of databases were being developed. This is in the late 1970s and the first part of the 1980s. And a number of computer scientists, including one at Yale by the name of Roger Schank, developed commercial applications where you could query by typing in a query, such as what were the annual profits on widgets last year? You know, this company makes widgets, some kind of little device, and you would have the program be able to give you back the answer. Well, the advertising for this program, I'll never forget, said, you know, this program understands natural language. I was younger then, and I was more less polite, I guess. So I went to a computer fair. I'll never forget, of a computer conference, and I saw this demonstration. They said, "Would you like to try?" And I said, "Sure." So I typed in, "If you would please be so kind as to let me know what the annual sales were of," what do you call them? Widgets, I think. And of course, that stumped the system. There was no way of parsing that. So it didn't do natural language understanding. It had a very limited set of understanding. But that has changed incredibly. You think about the Google searches you can do now, the database that's available to draw upon is, I'll just use a phrase, ginormous. I mean, it's huge and can understand some of the things that I just said, or that I had said so rudely when trying out that other system. Similarly, translation has, as I said, was the earliest some of the earliest efforts in natural language understanding. We think of it as a conceptually separate domain of artificial intelligence, but these days it uses exactly the same natural language understanding tools and natural language generation tools that these other functions of AI do as well. Okay, evolution of models. I showed you a diagram earlier of going from rule-based to statistical to neural networks. Just a little bit on the background of neural networks. It's interesting to see how within the domain of artificial intelligence, a particular concept or technology is tried, it doesn't work, such as with machine translation, and then we give up for a while, and then we come back to it largely because we have more computing power and models of software that didn't exist when the earlier notions were created. So the notion of neural networks actually goes way back to the 1940s. McCullough and Pitts, who had used logic and mathematical computation to explain how human neural mechanisms work. Well, in the 1940s, we didn't know much about how the human brain worked. We know some more now, but the attempt was to say, if these are gates with on and off, maybe in the brain, and to some extent they are, maybe we could model that on a computer. And that was why the neural, as in neurons on the brain, was used in the name. Marvin Minsky, who was one of the original people working on artificial intelligence, again, a computer scientist at MIT, had first done work on his doctoral dissertation on neural networks. And then he decided about 20 years later that no, they just don't work. And one of the reasons they didn't work is we didn't have the computer power, which they now do. And neural networks have been reborn, and the world of artificial intelligence has been turned on its head. Okay, so there are many models of neural networks. The most recent is called transformers. I'm not going to go into the details of how they work. I don't pretend to have a detailed understanding myself, but drawing upon that source of all knowledge, Wikipedia, here's just a simple definition of what a transformer software used, it's a version of neural networks, can do. A deep learning, okay, we talked about deep learning earlier, that is, you teach yourself, the computer teaches itself, or the software teaches itself. A deep learning model that was introduced in 2017, so it's pretty recent, that utilizes the mechanism of attention, weighing the influences of different parts of the input data. What all that means is you work on various layers of data, you search for patterns. So you're not doing statistics, you're looking for patterns that appear many times in this incredibly large, billions and billions of entries database. And based on the patterns of what has been input into that huge database, the computer system, the transformer model, figures out how to do what it's going to do. And it can generate language, but we'll talk about in a minute some of the other things it does without any training, just by looking at its database. Okay, so there are two main systems that are out there. There are others as well. One is known as BERT. And if you know anything about Sesame Street, yes, it is named after BERT, as in Bert and Ernie. There's an Ernie system as well. BERT stands for bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. But what you really need to know is when you do a search on Google today, it is using that system to drive the search. The other major system, which has gotten an incredible amount of press, and I gave you some readings on, is called OpenAI. It's a company that was started in California and has many of the major players that are funding it. The original system that was released partially was called GPT-3. We'll get to what that's, okay, that stands for Generation Pre-Training Transformer. That explains a lot, right? And now the newest model is GPT-3, and I'll bet they're working on GPT-4. Okay, so what is that all about? One of the questions in artificial intelligence is whether it's possible to have a program or system backed by a database that can do all sorts of things. Think of a Swiss Army knife. It can do many different kinds of things, as opposed to a system that just does one thing. So the question is it possible to create artificial general intelligence? And there have been all kinds of debates on this to say, no, 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 or yes, we might be getting there. In that context, there's a book that I came upon about 2 months ago that I really enjoyed, that's highly readable, that I highly, highly, highly recommend. It's by a journalist, Cad Metz. I think that's how you pronounce his first name, but I don't really know. It's called Genius Makers, the Mavericks Who Brought AI to Google, Facebook, and the World. And it's one of the clearest explanations of how modern neural networks and deep learning work. So if you're at all interested in the subject matter, that's where I would go. Okay, I had asked you folks to please read the article, Meet GPT-3, which gives a sort of layperson's introduction to how GPT-3 works. Then there's a video called What's It Like to Be a Computer, which I also asked you to take a look at. And I think it's with GPT-2 rather than GPT-3, but it gives an example of what happens when you ask a question and GPT-3, or a 2 probably, answers. So the floor is open for conversation, and I don't see where I can look at people raising their hands. So just talk. And here are my questions for you. What surprised you about the power of GPT-3? What surprised you? What made you say, huh? Can do that? Come on, unmute yourself and talk. Some of you, is that not working? Can you hear me?
It is working. Yes, we can hear you.
Good. Okay. So did anything surprise you? And if you didn't do your homework, well, you'll do it afterwards.
Well, if I can answer the question right now, the thing that really surprised me in the video, the one where there was the interview, was the fact that GPT-3 was able to make a joke, to make a sort of pun around purr, the purring of a cat. And that really, really, really surprised me. To use words creatively so as to make something that might be like a sort of play on words kind of thing.
Right. So the question is let me step back and say, as a linguist, one of the questions that we always asked, for all the years I worked on linguistics, was what's unique to humans about language? Just as there are questions about what is unique to humans, period. So there's the famous story of Socrates asking, the saying, a human is a featherless biped. A featherless biped. That's what makes humans unique. And then I forget who it was who comes up with a plucked chicken and says like this, because plucked chicken does not have feathers and has 2 feet. Okay, so figuring out what's uniquely human is hard. So we used to say, is having empathy uniquely human? Is having humor uniquely human? And when we get to talk about poetry, we'll talk about whether creativity is uniquely human. A wonderful anthropologist by the name of Jane Goodall famously established a number of decades ago now that tool making is not unique to humans. Okay, so what is unique to humans? And we don't really know until we push the boundaries. Okay, so let me just weigh in a little bit on some of the things that GPT-3 can do all by itself without needing to be taught. This is using deep learning via neural networks. GPT-3 can generate natural language. You saw that. It can do computer coding. Think of the hundreds of thousands of people who think they're going to get a job doing computer coding. And now here is a system that does it all by itself. Makes a few mistakes when it starts out, but it has a database on how to code, and it does a bang-up job of it. It can write legal briefs. We'll get a little later to the survey question of which professions might be put out of business. And a number of people were worried about translators. I understand why. Some of you are translators. Some of you weren't so worried about lawyers, but the lawyers are scared silly because there are so many programs out there that, in fact, law firms are now using that put lawyers out of business for writing briefs and doing discovery and so forth, that used to pay big bucks to individual lawyers and law firms. Okay, music. I played you that weird combination of Beethoven and Chopin that was automatically generated. And it was generated before my ears, as it were, using a program that I accessed. Poetry generation we'll get to, and translation for darn sure. Okay. So here's another question. Should OpenAI let everyone have access to the software? Why or why not? Are there dangers in using the software? If so, are there problems with the software? If so, what? Thoughts? The floor is open. Other people have tongues. Yes, Delphine.
Hi.
And the hand, which is great, thank you.
My intuition is to say no at first, which is...
No, which you shouldn't have it out to everybody, or no, you shouldn't restrict it?
No, it shouldn't be out to everyone.
Okay.
And it is a little counterintuitive for me to say that because I'm usually an open standards kind of person. However, given the recentness of the technology and also the lack of understanding of its black box nature, that we don't really know exactly how it works, except that it just echoes biases. I think it has a lot of potential for a lot of danger in the sense of expanding inequality and populism, fascism, all the things that I guess a majority of people would say we're trying to work against.
Right.
So I would say that more research needs to be done before it eventually maybe should be, but not at this point in time.
Right. There's a new book out that you might be interested in. I guess it came out last fall by an author named Brian Christian. And it's called, I think it's The Alignment Problem. Just a second, I have the book jacket here. Yes, my mind still works. The Alignment Problem. And it talks, the subtitle is Machine Learning and Human Values. And it talks about just this issue of the kinds of biases that get replicated in general in AI. You know, so when it comes to reading resumes automatically, granting parole to prisoners, granting mortgages to people who are applying, all those biases that we like to think we got rid of face-to-face, which we really didn't, are just being cloned. Okay, so what do we do about it? Also in terms of fake news, all kinds of stuff gets generated, and we have a problem with fake news, especially in the United States, as you may have heard. We banned Trump from Facebook for a reason, but at least for 2 years. But GPT-3 has the real potential to generate all kinds of stuff that we just don't know what to do with. Maria Sophia.
Yes, I wanted to add something to following what Delphine has just said. It's not easy to answer this question because although I think it should not be open to everybody to use. I do think it should be public. And what I mean by that is that considering that we are living in a multiple world in which there is no institution, no form of institutional power that can govern that globalization, and having this kind of technology being open for anyone to use, what's going to create is that those even non-political actors, which at the moment are even more powerful than certain governments, can use it to their own advantage. So it does risk to further aggravate the trends that we are already seeing. So in my view, it should not be open to anybody, for everybody to use, but it should be public. So I'm thinking that the usage could be regulated by an international institution such as the EU or the UN, providing that it is a little more, that its competence is a little bit wider than it is right now. Because even if you give it to single national states, then it's the survival of the fittest, basically. And you have just like we are seeing now with the vaccine, you have the richest, wealthiest countries that use it to their own advantage, and everybody else cannot compete. So I think that it should be open, but institutionalized in a way, not to sound too socialist, but I think that's the only safe way to make sure that everybody gets an equal chance to get access to these technologies, and that something apocalyptic doesn't happen.
Okay, Sven. Sven, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, I just clicked the wrong button. Okay, so thank you. Regarding the question whether or not it should be publicly available, I think the question is not really whether the code should be publicly available, but also whether the data sets they used for training should be publicly available, because frankly speaking, they're much more important than the code itself. So in our project, we're working with Tacotron 2 by Google. And frankly speaking, they wrote this nice paper where they claimed all these amazing things that Tacotron 2 can do. However, nobody I know of could ever replicate what they claimed in the paper. So for the time being, I'm not too worried about the availability of the code so that people can do a lot with it. They probably can't. But the real gold mine, so to say, I would say, is the database that has been used in the training.
Right, and let me just respond to that from an American perspective. OpenAI wanted to be, an open company, having things available for the good of mankind, personkind. But guess what? Their money is coming from people who want to make money. There's a reason that Google has all its ads and that it sells your data, right?
Yeah, of course.
That Amazon does the same thing. So if you spend these many millions of dollars, and it's probably going to get to the billion by the time they're done, building that database, and the software is basically there. It says go learn on your own. That's an oversimplification, but you know what I mean, I think. You're going to want to monetize it. So all those lawyers who are being put out of business for not having to do discovery themselves, they want to charge, and they already are, a lot for the program. And whether it's GPT-3 or some version thereof, they're going to have to make their money somehow to stay in business. So part of the answer to the question, of the value of that database is the value of the database monetarily to the people who I bet you are going to monetize it. Okay, let me just move on to one other question, because there's many other things we want to talk about. And that is the issue that Delphine, I think, raised. Does it matter, or the point she raised, and I'll put it as a question, does it matter that we don't understand how the program works? Because the program doesn't tell you how it accomplished what it accomplishes. So you folks are more the expert than I on the European data protection laws. And I remember reading, and then I went to try to figure it out, something about the transparency requirement in the data protection regulation. And again, you can correct me, please, if I'm wrong. It says something like, you must ensure you can tell individuals about your processing in a way that's easily accessible and easy to understand. Well, if the people who are doing the programming or the use of these tools themselves don't know how the program arrived at the results it had, how the heck do you tell users and users of that program? So there's some legal issues there, but it's more, but there's the larger question of, do we feel comfortable making decisions that affect people's lives on the basis of a program whose output, whose workings rather, we don't understand? So there's some additional considerations. One is power consumption. There was a wonderful article on how much power GPT-3 consumes. I mean, we know that part of the problem with the cloud, doesn't that sound very nice? It's just all up in outer space. No, there are these server farms that generate an incredible amount of heat, thank you, as well as the power necessary to keep them going. And one of the reasons that GPT-3 is not just going to be available to everyone is the power consumption is off the charts. There's a plagiarism issue. So one of the things that I think about is you could give an essay topic to GPT-2, which a lot of people do have access to, and it works pretty well, and say, you know, here's the first line of my essay. And what GPT-2 can do, as well as 3, is write the rest of the essay, drawing on the database. And then the student can, you know, clean it up a little bit in case there's some profanity in there, or something that's racist or sexist or whatever, and then submit it. And there's no way the faculty member, the PhD candidates do not get any ideas, there's no way the faculty member can track down that this was plagiarized because it's not in anybody's database. It will never be created again just the same way. Okay, so there's a real issue. There's the fake news issue. There's the job killer issue, which we will get to. Okay, let's continue. If I can get this to move. Yes. So poetry. Here's a stanza of a sonnet. Yet in a circle pallid as it flowed by this bright sun, that with his light display rolled from the sands and half the buds of snow, and calmly on him shall impose away. You notice the author there is not Shakespeare, but Deep Spear. This was a really interesting project to see if you could input all the sonnets of Shakespeare and then create, and I don't think it was a GPT-2, but a comparable kind of tool, create a new sonnet. And, you know, maybe this one isn't great, but it's not so bad. I asked that you all look at a video it was a TED Talk by Oscar Schwartz in Australia, Can a Computer Write Poetry? And it was, I hope you had a chance to see the video. He and colleagues of his created a really interesting tool which unfortunately does not seem to be available online anymore. It's called Bot or Not. And it would generate a poem, and you would have to say, is this by a human or not by a human? And in that video, I won't replay it because you saw it, I hope, or you will. In that video, it was really clear that the audience of the TED Talk didn't do so well in determining if a poem was written by a human or not. So the question that Oscar Schwartz asked in that, well, let me ask a question first. Why is poetry, this is a question for you, why is poetry a good venue for doing natural language generation? Why is poetry a good venue? And by the way, the answer is the same as for music. Think about it. Why these successes? Okay, particularly people who play music or people who write poetry or like to read poetry. Think about it. Why would automatic generation work so well in poetry and in music? Giorgio.
I would have two hypotheses. One is that it is not completely narrative, so you can evoke some links between sentences and concepts. And the other is that you often have a rhythm, so it's easier to follow a pattern. It's easier to find rules.
Exactly. Okay, so if you have ever had a poetry class in your earlier days and you were taught what are the rules of writing a sonnet, what are the rules of writing a limerick, what are the rules of writing counterpoint in music, what are the rules for writing a sonata? And it's not that the music is all the same, but there really are rules that you can lay out. And those are comparatively easy to program. I say comparatively, but much easier than doing a lot of natural language generation. So it turns out that these are venues that a lot of people have worked on. There are poetry contests now, for computer generated poetry, who writes the best and so forth. And you know it's computer generated, but who writes the best poetry? With music, there are a number of tests that have been done for writing in the style of Bach as opposed to real Bach. So if you don't know everything that Bach has ever written, and you hear a Bach cantata, you don't easily figure out, and expert musicians have not always been able to figure out, was this actually Bach or was it computer generated? Okay, so now the question that Oscar Schwartz asked, do we need to rethink what it means to be creative? And his question really led to, and we'll talk more about it at the very end of our conversation. Do we need to rethink what it means to be a human being? And we've talked about that. I want to just leave those questions with us, and we'll get back to them at the very end of the discussion. There's been a fair amount of literature written on whether it's right to talk about AI as being creative. Is that an oxymoron? Is it not the case that it makes sense to talk about creativity and AI in the same breath? Well, some of that discussion has suggested that maybe we're approaching this issue the wrong way. So instead of talking about whether AI can be creative or can't be creative, maybe we need to think about that which AI creates or produces, if you don't like the word create, as a new kind of category of art that's worthy in its own right. So there is computer generated art, some of which actually sells for very large amounts of money, some of which doesn't look too shabby. But do we want to compare it to art created by humans, or do we want to think of it as a different genre unto itself? Okay, let's get to the survey that I asked you to do. And I know that 22 of you have responded by now, but I stopped at 20. And let's start with, what happened to, let me go back a second. Sorry, let's get to the survey that dealt, the question that dealt with professions. So the question I asked was, please indicate if you're concerned that use of artificial intelligence is a potential threat to the following kinds of writers and professions. Check all that you're concerned about. And of the 20 people, 15 or 75% worried that artificial intelligence was a threat to translators. You've seen even from Google Translate what it can do, as well as from other programs, I'm sure. Some of you, 55%, again, this is a small sample size, but it's probably pretty representative. 55% said journalists are in trouble. Journalists are in big trouble. So starting in 2011, the magazine, sort of business magazine, Forbes, decided that it was going to use AI to do some of the work that they had done basically by hand for years. They used a program from a company called Narrative Science, and there are a number of these companies that produce natural language parsing or natural language understanding programs, complete with looking at databases of numbers. And they realized that Forbes, using this software from Narrative Science, could generate earnings reports of the Fortune 500. And they could do it in a couple of minutes at most, instead of over weeks. And you have to do this for quarterly reports. So it's and then annual reports. So that's a huge amount of person time, expensive person time. And now you could have a computer do it. Jobs. financial contracts. We're getting to journalism, trust me. JP Chase, a large bank, in 2007 created a program for reviewing financial contracts. And the acronym is COIN. It doesn't matter what it stands for. It was an AI-driven program. It can review instantaneously, not in a couple of minutes, instantaneously, what took over 300,000 human hours a year to do. If you look at the billable rates of the people who work for JP Chase, and you multiply that by 300,000, you could be much more than a millionaire, okay? So this is eating, this meaning AI programming is really eating into the professions. Getting to newspapers. Bloomberg News uses a program called Cyborg. The Associated Press uses a program called Wordsmith that is by a company called Automated Insights. Every large newspaper in the country in the United States, and I suspect internationally, is now writing news articles automatically. Sometimes at the very bottom of the article, it will say who the author or what the author was, not who the author was. And you read the books on journalism and on digital journalism, and they sang some nice songs saying, oh, now journalists are going to be free to write the in-depth investigative reporting articles and the feature stories that have a human component to them. But look what's happening to newspapers around the world. They are closing. They are reducing their news staffs. I am not convinced that journalism is going to be a viable profession for anything at all like the number of people who have been in the profession before, which I think is to our detriment. Okay, now getting to spell check and the survey. And it was interesting to see what responses I got from you folks. Again, this is a very small survey, a very small response rate, and I can't say it's representative of the world, but I have a hunch that the responses, had I done this in the United States, would be different. Okay, so what did you folks say? And let me turn this on so you can comment when you want to. So of the 20 people who responded, 50%, 10 people, said it's automatic, so I don't think about it. 10% said I never use it. And then various other people had individual responses. I'll just read a couple of them. I use it at the end so I can learn from my errors. Please remember that phrase, learn from my errors. I have the spell check on at all times to catch any spelling errors. And then that person went on to say, because it's a nuisance when it tries to correct a variety of English, because there's American English and there's British English, and you can decide which one you want to use, but spell check isn't always set to the one you want. Or I have the spell check on at all times to catch any spelling errors. Or I try to understand what mistakes I make. I use it, but I also check with my own judgment. So there are at least a couple of people commenting that I don't use it, or that I want to learn from what the mistakes I make. I want to check it against my own judgment. You all sound like really good writers and students. I'm proud of you. The next question was, like the best answer that describes any impact you think spell check has on your own ability to spell words correctly. 40% said doesn't have any effect. Again, small numbers, but it's still an interesting mix. 25% said it makes me a worse speller. 30% said it makes me a better speller. And I reflected on this because from my own personal experience, as well as my own students in the United States, ever since spell check became something that just came on automatically, I don't even know how to turn it off these days. They all became worse spellers. I became a worse speller. Was I a good student and said, I have to learn from this mistake, I have to remember how this word is spelled? No, I go and I make the same mistakes over and over and over again. Now, when I had a dictionary, and I had a physical dictionary, and I still have one sitting on my shelf, you have to open the book, you have to, I'm not talking about an online dictionary, I'm talking about you have to find where the word is. I was more likely to remember the spelling because I put a lot of effort into it. With spell check, I don't put any effort into it. Bing, it's corrected. The same thing with predictive texting. Bing, it corrects, it corrects my words. And that's to my detriment. And again, I don't know if this is an American issue or not, but it's something to think about. Just a little bit on the history of spell check. Originally, you could turn it on or off. You had to accept or reject a particular suggestion. Those are the old days. The new days are, at least in the version of Microsoft Word that I use, it just comes on, and I guess I could figure out how to turn it off, but then my spelling would look really terrible, and I'd have to pull out an online or physical dictionary, and it saves me time if I don't do that right. Similarly, and I didn't ask a question on this, is the prevalence of grammar and style checkers. These first were developed for basically so-called mini computers on Unix machines. Back in the 1970s, there was a program called Writer's Workbench, where it would give you recommendations on how to correct your grammar or how to make it more accessible in terms of reading level. That then went on to be developed by Microsoft in 1992 with its first grammar checker. Then ETS, which is the Educational Testing Service, they're the ones who make the SAT and the GRE and other kinds of professional tests, the TOEFL, which you may know and hate, I don't know. That same company said, you know what, it's the same AI programming, and this is pre-use of neural networks. It's the same programming that lets us recognize grammatical structures, because that's the basis on which we were grading essays automatically anyway. So we could have a tool, we could sell a tool, which is what they do to American universities and high schools, called Criterion. That all sounds so nice, but it's all electronically rated, not by humans. The program that my students use, and there's a free version, and I guess there's a version you don't have to pay that much for, is called Grammarly. And I just asked some of my students, does anyone know about Grammarly? And they said, of course, duh. I mean, come on, we all use it before we ever submit an essay. So I see some hands. Sven?
Yes, thank you. Just a quick comment on the use of the spell checker. So in our larger research group, we have a few people who work on assistive driving technologies. And they basically say that in driving assistance system, the research shows that the more you rely on assistive driving technologies, the worse of a driver you become. So in their field, this is already a relatively established concept, it seems. So I would wager that it's probably the same for, spell checkers and so on.
Mm-hmm. If you have any references and you can send them to me, I'd be really grateful.
I have to ask around, because this is really very much, apart from what I usually do. But
I do understand. nbaron@american.edu. You'll find me if you put my name in.
Yes.
Whenever,
I'll see what I can
grateful.
find.
Maria Sophia.
Yeah, I wanted to comment also on spell check, and I was one of the ones that gave the individual response, actually. But I don't know if it's just me, because using spell check helps me in those cases in which I want to use a phrase, mostly, for instance, an idiomatic expression, especially if I'm texting. And I've heard the expression, but I never wrote it. And so I might hear it in a way, and then I don't know the correct spelling. And in that way, it does help me a lot. But I'm thinking, considering what you just said, if it's not just the case of how somebody learns a language and what works best for them, because for me, it might be hearing that works better, and for other people it might be reading. And so in that case it does work for me, but it might not work for other cases, because I've seen that spell check has made me a better speller. When it mostly happens with idiomatic expressions, not with words you will use in academic text or in normal everyday conversation. So
okay, and that makes me hypothesize, and I'd love to see someone do a study on this. People who have done serious learning of another language, which you all have, are probably more likely to learn from spell check than people who are essentially monolingual, which is most of Americans, and they're required to take some foreign language, but very, very, very few people become fluent in another language. So if you have a mindset that says, I want to learn from a tool, and the tool might be a dictionary, whether it's a physical dictionary or an online dictionary or spell check, then I suspect there'd be a greater likelihood of learning. But this would be an interesting experiment. Okay, we'll take one more question from Julia.
Yes, so I just wanted to say that I actually wanted to say what you just said, that like no, but like seriously, I don't use the predictive texting that much because I find it annoying. It's never, there's never the word that I'm searching for, and I just hate it. But for the spell check, I use it. I don't usually read the, let's say, what the program would say, oh, you should write it like this, but I check the mistake, like usually when there is like the subtitle on, like the little underlining under the word. And that's and I agree with Maria Sofia, like for me it's really useful because I discover maybe new words or new or things that I thought were written in a certain way and actually are written in another, or maybe the differences between American English and British English, and then I check which one I'm using. And I think and I wanted to say exactly that as let's say a bilingual person, a person that uses more languages, it is actually very useful for me. And it's faster, since I have to talk with many people, I can't always have a dictionary next to me, so it's faster, but I still learn a lot with the spell checking. So yes.
So your hypothesis, if you grew up bilingual from
well, I didn't grow up bilingual, I learned it and during my life. Or
if one grew up bilingual, so let me talk about two kinds of bilinguals. One is someone who grew up bilingual and maybe mixed languages at age 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, but grew up bilingual and didn't have to study a second language. A person who has had to study a second language and become incredibly successful with it, nonetheless has a studying attitude that may be different. So we now need a three-way experiment: monolinguals, native bilinguals, people who've acquired a second or third language. Okay, Giorgio, have I been ignoring you?
No, thank you. It's just, I don't want to make a lecture of my own, but I have the impression that there's an overlapping here between, how can I say, the ethical side and the cognitive side. First of all, for what concerns originality, and then for what concerns the extended mind, right? So first of all, a lot of people here talking, and you seem to imply, I think unwillingly, that there's a clear divide between us and this kind of device and this kind of tools that do things for us. But the cognitive current theory is that they are all part of our extended mind. And of course, yes, if one day electricity goes off, or if one deprives us of our spell checker, that will be some sort of tragedy. But until we have them, they're part of our cognition. So we implicitly choose not to devote our neurons to remember that, because we know that spell checker will correct us. And by the way, in the last weeks, actually, I've switched the way I write papers in English from writing them directly in English to writing them in Italian with the Pel, and then checking the translation. And I see that my style actually improved, because I had so many hypostasized structures and grammatical and expressions that I kept using and so on. But the other thing is originality, no? I was for a short time a very poor man's copywriter for an online website, doing technical website for content for technical website for like plumbers and so on. And you don't write for people, you write for AIs to retrieve your text. So you write knowing this set of rules, and it doesn't really matter what you write. And journalism is like that. You don't really write for your audience unless you're doing this amazing piece for, I don't know, the New Yorker investigative piece, but otherwise you're writing for AI first and then for a real audience. So you're already thinking in terms of oh, I should put these words here and there, and this number of words, and this percentage has to be around this semantic field, and so on. And similarly, students, I mean, most of them are taught and to write in a certain way, to structure their papers in a certain way, yes, for clarity, but it also uniforms already a lot the way they structure, the way they think something should be properly explained. So is all this a problem, and is this an ethical problem or a cognitive problem? I don't think it is a cognitive problem. I think it may be an ethical problem, but I'm not sure. And very last thing, if one grows up studying literature, because I think in literature this is more evident, in the 60s and 70s, there has been so much art creation. Well, actually, it's not only literature, around the idea of writing, following formulas, no, the Oulipo in France, and or pastiche, so doing something in the style of something else. I think that there's an implied idea of what is original here, which I don't really align to. I mean, maybe if I understand the ethical side of it. Is it done by a human? Is there a human contribution to it? But I think both the cognitive side and the originality value are not important. Sorry for the very long.
I thank you much. And Delphine, if you would excuse me, save your comment to the end. I want to make sure we get to the pièce de résistance at the very end, which is some of your comments. And I will just comment that on Giorgio's statement that there's a lot of question about what do we still need to have in our heads and where is partnership the way to go. And we'll talk about spelling in a minute. I'm going to say something very briefly about predictive texting, and I may skip Google reply, I don't know, and we'll see, because I want to get to the last part of the survey that we want to talk about. But just a little bit on predictive texting. I asked what best this, for the survey, what best describes how you feel about predictive texting. A number of you, 20%, which again is not that many people, complained that it makes many mistakes. 25% said I'm really happy with it. Somebody said it speeds up the writing process. Someone else said, I sometimes enjoy looking at the predictive options and use them. So this is at least a human interacting with what the program is saying. Sometimes I find it useful. Sometimes it changes words when it shouldn't. I prefer to make some mistakes, in essence, myself, rather than have unwanted correction. I only use it when I'm unsure of the spelling. I'm not fully satisfied, but often it helps me work more quickly. So what's clear is there's sort of mixed emotions about predictive texting. It probably does speed things up because you don't have to input all that stuff, assuming that you're doing it with your thumb or finger, however you work on your mobile phone, as opposed to something verbally. Then the question of, do you think predictive texting affects the way you write, the words you use, how long your messages are? And this I thought was interesting. Half of you, again, it was only 10 people, but it was a beginning survey, said has no effect. Probably 2 people said, yes, I write more complex, longer messages because of predictive texting. And then 30%, again, small number, but there it is. It was said, I write shorter or simpler messages. And the fact that some people said no effect, or I write longer messages and more complex messages, came up against the study that I asked you to take a look at, the user-friendly version of the study, which was an interesting experiment done at Harvard. And they wanted to see whether predictive texting changed the kinds of language you used when you were asked to give caption for a photograph. And the conclusions they came to were that when you used predictive textings to write captions, again, this is a limited context, and it's not the kind of predictive texting that most people actually do. That's the problem with controlled experiments. They may or may not reflect actual usage of normal people in normal circumstances. But what they found is that the machine, their phrase was, the messages are more succinct. That means shorter. They were more predictable. We used fewer unexpected words. They had fewer adjectives, and there were lots of things that had colors in them, so they used fewer color adjectives. And that, in essence, was what we would call an unexpected consequence of the technology. Because when predictive texting was created, it was meant to just make it easier to input a message, figuring out, I think I know what you want to say. And with the newest neural network technologies, there's a pretty good notion of what you want to say based on the pattern recognition of this incredibly large database that the program draws upon. I don't know if Americans are more susceptible to writing shorter, simpler messages, but this was a study done in the United States, than Europeans. Again, that would be interesting to look at, and perhaps interesting to look at in light of the last question we're going to look at in just a couple of minutes, namely, what do you like most about writing by hand? A very human activity. Okay, I think we're going to skip the smart reply because some of you use it and some of you don't know what it is, and move on to human authorship. But I want to have enough time for us to look at some of the things that you said. So the question is, the question of the book that I am now working on. So today's discussion is my first foray in talking with people about some of the things that I'm writing a new book on. The new book is called Who Wrote This? And it's looking at the potential effects of AI on what we write and whether we still want to write. So I begin the book, I've just started working on looking at why people write in the first place. So going to the question of, well, we partner with AI and it doesn't really matter if you're writing a newspaper article because you're not really writing from the heart or whatever. Why do we write? And there are a huge number of reasons why we write. And we don't have time to get into those, but I want to focus on the question that I did my last book on, namely whether medium matters, whether you read online or digitally more generally, or you read in print, whether that matters for how you read. And now I'm switching the question for whether the medium on which you write matters. Does it matter if you're typing or typing at a computer or inputting on a mobile phone or whatever, as opposed to writing by hand, which Americans at least do much less of. I know it's writing by hand is still more prominent in a number of European countries. So the question that I asked is, what's the one thing you like most about writing by hand? What's the one thing you like least about writing by hand? And I'm not going to talk about the SMS issues. I'm just going to talk about the writing by hand because the things that were said were incredibly interesting. I'll start with the things that people like least about writing by hand. That it's slow, that you get writer's cramp, that you have messy handwriting, that you don't have all those editing tools that online writing has. I get all that. But what you said, you collectively, about what you liked most about writing by hand really gave me pause. So I started categorizing a little bit. A number of you talked about the direct connections of handwriting to your mind. So again, I'm not attaching names to any of these, but you may recognize what you wrote. I have the impression of it being unmediated. And I sort of got what that meant. I can connect extremely well with my brain, my untold feelings, my subconscious, the track it leaves in my mind. I feel an immediate and intimate connection between my thoughts and the process of writing. I like to see what I have in my mind transcribed on paper. I can see what I'm thinking. And I hadn't anticipated any of these, but they're amazing. Comments relating to memory. I can remember what I have written by hand better. And there's actually a lot of literature on that. It helps me remember what I wrote. Mental focus. I have to focus on what I want to write so as not to delete a sentence too many times if it's not correct or suitable for the concept I want to express. Physicality, and again, there's a lot of research on the haptics of writing by hand. The ability to see how emotion literally affects shape and pressure, which I assume means the shape of the characters that are being written. Whoever wrote this, feel free to correct me if I'm misinterpreting, and the amount of pressure you're putting on your writing implement. And then there were some comments about the similarity to drawing, the smoothness of the handwriting action itself, comparable to drawing or painting. And then there were some personal comments. I use the surface I'm writing on exactly as I prefer, but as I get to choose the surface, it's not that same old keyboard of whatever sort or keypad. I'm free to write what I want, the way I want. Nothing keeps telling me back that I need to adjust my spelling or color. So is it color or C-O-L-O-R, C-O-L-O-U-R, British or American, American or British, and punctuation. You know, so all these automatic correction programs telling you what you're supposed to do. I don't want to do that, thank you. And I get frustrated myself when I'm writing something with Microsoft Word, because the program that's in there says you must put commas in particular places, but American English no longer puts commas. Their program is out of date, but it drives me nuts because it keeps wanting to put that comma in for me. Then I reflected on a study that I did with a Korean colleague who teaches in Australia. And we surveyed students, these were university students, on their thinking about writing by hand versus writing on a computer versus writing on mobile phones. So some of the results from, this was the Australian component of the survey, said some really interesting things about writing by hand. And I'll just quote a couple of them. I think that with handwriting, you actually have to engage more. You have to concentrate on what you're actually writing. Where typing, say on a computer, you can just blank out. Or when you're doing handwriting, you have to stop and think. Now I've got a clear picture in my mind of what I'm going to talk about and how it can flow through. And like I said, you're sort of thinking as you're going, what's coming next all the time. Or handwriting something to pen and paper is an extension of you, because you physically can touch it. You can physically run your hands over the words because there's indentation from the pen. I'm thinking about that pressure comment earlier and the force that you've used on the paper. So this leads me to the next question of whether it matters how and what humans write. So let's go back to spelling for a second and recall the results from spell check. If you look at the history of English spelling, which I know more about than I do about Italian spelling, up until about the mid-18th century, about 1750-ish, norms of English spelling really were not that important. There are a number of reasons why. For darn sure, around 1600, there were no set conventions of spelling. Often printers would use different spellings of words, add an E at the end of the word that's no longer pronounced, thanks to changes in pronunciation in the English language, from Middle English to early modern English, just to fill out the line and to help justify the line so the printing looked better. Shakespeare spelled his own name many different ways. Didn't seem to bother anyone. So one of the issues is whether we care about spelling. So if we keep spell check, we're probably not going to revert to there being no standards for spelling. But what we might revert to is not taking spelling as something we feel is important to learn how to do. There are various things I used to know how to do that now are done automatically for me. Is spelling going to be one of them? And then the last question is, if AI can write more effectively and efficiently than people, what are the implications for the professions? We talked a little bit about that, but what are the implications for our souls, for who we are as human beings? And now I want to open that up for discussion. What are the implications if AI can write more efficiently and effectively than people, what are the implications? Delphina, did I see your hand go up? No.
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay.
I mean, I have a lot of things to say. I'm gonna try to stay short. My bachelor's degree is in human evolutionary biology, so I think there's a lot of connection here with, right, like the questions of what makes humans human. Even if we take computers out of the conversation for a second, and we only stay within the organic world, even there it's not that clear, but language is perhaps the one theory that most evolutionary biologists stand behind if they had to choose something that makes humans human. So in that sense, responding a bit to what Georgia was saying, like I understand this idea that something like spell check can just be seen as a cognitive extension of our mind, just like any other tool, like a hammer, right? But I think that because there's such a formative aspect of language, you know, our experience of life is mediated through language, then there's something a little bit more complicated, which connects to your last question related to, you know, our soul. And I think the key would be, for me, I'm thinking more like it's not an issue of the originality of product. I mean, even though that is something, but rather the experience of individuality. And that is where the ethical, cognitive issues come out for me, because the experience of individuality is mostly mediated through language. And if we have something that is kind of flattening the human experience of language because, you know, we're being trained to all think in the same kind of language, then I think that is a quite scary situation. And the last thing you were saying of, you know, spell check and what that could mean in terms of reverting, I wonder, like my question would be, could something like spell check lead to less organic evolution of language? Because evolution in every sense comes through mistakes, errors, mishaps. And if we don't really have the space for that, then what happens?
Okay, so now you're talking about language change. And if indeed errors can be a source of language change, will the language stop changing? But let's think about domains. So spelling of a word is something that can change. So when the United States became the United States and broke away from Britain, there were a number of rejections of British spelling for American spelling. And then there have been all kinds of moves to change spelling to more phonetic spelling. You know, even George Bernard Shaw had a system for changing spellings, and that failed. And in the United States, we've had movements. In some ways, the spellings of words are less important, I suspect, than grammar, than whether you have, whether you talked about dreamed or dreamt, swam or swimmed. Okay, so those are some changes that have taken place between use of German strong verbs versus Germanic weak verbs and so forth. And then we change what we consider to be grammatical. Is it okay to say him and me went home? I hope not. But it is very clear that at least in the United States, they is now being used as a singular pronoun. And that's a change that a number of newspapers have adopted as well. You know, I saw The Lawyer. They were really on my case, even though it was one lawyer. Okay, so those are changes that I think are more fundamental. If you look at some of the spellings of at least English words, they are maintaining their structure from before what was called the Great Vowel Shift. I mean, they have no relationship between the letters and the word and the pronunciation, and we haven't changed those. So I'm probably less concerned, just my take, about the spelling, about spell check hampering language change than I am about the other kind, than thinking about other kinds of language change. But a really good comment. But now let me ask, because we have a rousing 5 minutes left, other comments on our humanity and our creativity. I'm looking for a hand, but I don't see any. Sven.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just like a more, I don't know, epistemological thought here. So I think the question that we ought to keep in mind when talking about artificial intelligence is whether the computer system actually knows anything or is just very, very good at pattern matching.
Right.
I wager it's the latter, but well.
We know it's true. We know it's true. And anybody who's in AI will tell you the system doesn't know anything. What it does, and these days it's pattern matching that we use. Before it was statistics, before that was rules. Does it know anything? No. But the question becomes, if our, let me start over. As a person who is taught for many decades, I ask myself, what do my students know? And I can ask the same question of myself. I'm not just picking on students. What do I know? Have I borrowed something from a source and then spouted it as my own? Okay, does that constitute knowledge? Or is knowledge something that I've got to figure out myself and integrate myself with other things I may have picked up along the line? So you take the standard distinction between data, or among data, information, and knowledge. So a datum is just a piece of something. Information, you have a number of pieces of data. Knowledge is something that you put together in a more meaningful way. And our problem, I think, is that we use the word knowledge so loosely these days, we don't know what knowledge means. But to the extent we'd like to talk about humans knowing something, there's got to be, I would like to propose, a human component where you had to do the work yourself. And we come up to, there's a reason that human beings, given the same information, come to different conclusions. So let's talk about two well-meaning, non-racially biased, non-gender biased voters. And I think about in the United States, people who voted for either Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump versus Joe Biden and Donald Trump. There are all kinds of problems with Donald Trump. Trust me, I lived through this. I live in Washington, January 6th, I know this. But there also are some things that Trump has done or that his advisors advised him to do that weren't totally crazy, particularly during the 2016 election. It is definitely the case that Hillary Clinton overlooked half of the country and did not understand where they hurt. So there were people who were actually educated, they had graduate degrees, they were not bad people who on the basis of information made a decision. I disagree with their decision, but I understand it better now that we know what went wrong in that particular election. So I think, and going to the question of what is it that computers are going to do? What is it we're going to do? We're going to have to stand our ground as to what it is we want humans to be able to do. So just going back to that question, that's going to be the first chapter of my book, of who wrote this, why do we write? I mean, what you folks said about handwriting is so revelatory, but there's a huge literature, often written by some very well-known authors. I think of an article by Joan, American writer, but there are many, many others talking about why they write, what it does for their souls, what it does to try to connect with other people, what it means to try to change minds coming from the depths of need. It's like, why do you volunteer for something? You do it for yourself at least as much, if not more, than you do it for the person you're helping. So I think we've got to figure out what we want human knowledge to be and what we want human creativity to be. We have 1 minute left for a last question or comment. Anybody?
maybe just a quick follow-up. I think, we shouldn't be too worried about the, computer writing poetry. I mean, we get shown this one good one, but not the like 150 bad ones that the program output before. So.
And you don't get to see the 150 bad poems that I wrote. I only try to select the best.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you all very much. This has been a joy to talk with you. I hope that my conversation from my part has sparked some interest. I hope I've given you some people's work to read. And I would love to hear from you. Again, it's NBAR. I can put it in the chat. So probably have gotten too much of the chat from me, too much from me already. But there's my email, and I would love to know if there are any other thoughts you have. Please, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naomi. It's been an excellent session, I think. A lot of participation. And we'll look forward to meeting you next time. Okay.
I'll be there. I'll be there.
Okay.
Thank you
Thanks
all.
a lot. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.